Hello, and welcome to the first of the tree news you can use for 2023. This is a collaborative work group between the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council, the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, UT Extension, and the UT School for Natural Resources. My name is Neil Verkler. I am an arborist technician at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I'm a board certified master arborist. So, what's probably still on everybody's mind from last year is evaluating the freeze damage in their landscape. And particularly it's on our mind because of what happened in December of last year. Uh, Maybe you can say it wasn't a deep freeze, but it sure was a cold snap. Uh, for us here in Knoxville, December 23rd was a bit of a snap. So over the course of about 12 hours, uh, actually really over the course of just a few hours, our temperatures dropped more than 40 degrees and then just sort of like bounced around in the low single digits, got up into maybe in the 20s, and then basically just bopped around very low sub-freezing temperatures for several days. And we were just the one-off. Nashville had the same experience, obviously a little bit earlier compared to us as the system moved from west to east, but the whole South was affected. So to sort of figure out or to get a handle on what is going on, let's just talk about a little bit of plant biology, very simple stuff. Yes, I know I'm an amazing artist and I'm missing a lot of stuff on here, but this is essentially a plant cell. And if you look under a microscope, you're not going to see much more than this. But within this, you have a central vacuole area that's composed of mostly water. We'll just say that it's just mostly water. And the amount of pressure that it pushes on the outside of this cell is and keeps it plump is what we consider Turner pressure. The thing with having water, basically a water bladder inside of a cell, is that when water freezes, it expands and it expands into these very sharp points. So if you have a bunch of water and it starts to expand with a bunch of sharp points and nucleation sites, well, you're going to have ruptures. And just imagine taking a head of lettuce and tossing it in your freezer and then overnight and pulling it out the next day and put it on your counter and watching it get very, very sad. So plants have strategies typically for dealing with cold weather. They go into dormancy. Our deciduous trees will lose their leaves, pulling their nutrients out of those leaves, out of those vulnerable tissues for that cold weather period, and sort of huddle. They'll slow down the metabolic process and just sort of wait for conditions to be right again for them to photosynthesize again. But even their evergreens will lower the freezing point of the water inside their cells by doing replacements. They'll flood their cells with sugars or proteins or terpenes, and some of them flood them with things like calcium. But these processes do take a bit of time. And this cold snap that we had was just the first couple of days into the start of winter. So it brings up the idea of if you have these processes, then why do trees grow where they grow? And so we can get into the idea of hardiness zones. Now, the hardiness zones are something that the USDA developed. They are regions divided by 10-degree Fahrenheit zones based on the average annual minimum temperature in the region. The USDA did an update in 2012, and they used information gathered from between 1976 and 2005 for their information. Because as you can see, in the state of Tennessee, we fall somewhere in 6A through 7B, maybe a few areas of 8A, but we're fairly typical. So our temperature ranges can range anywhere from that low, negative temperatures, negative single digit temperatures, to maybe just those, single digit temperatures or low teens. And that's our coldest times. So a lot of plants and a lot of nurseries will actually give you a zone range for where this tree can grow, so what it can withstand. But it's also important to remember that hardiness zones for plant species are also kind of dependent on where the plant nursery is located, where it's grown. There's a lot of research that shows that plants actually have seed memory. So if you're going to be getting plants from a nursery, it's really good to get them from a very close location, no more than say 100 miles from where you're actually going to be planting the tree. And I would suggest this book. This is the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, written by Michael Durr. It's an excellent source. I crack into this book uh, quite often. Um, this is probably a couple times a month that I'm looking into this book to, you know, get a little bit more information on trees. But it's important to have, multiple sources. So let's sort of start getting into the beginnings of this damage, of this freezing damage and evaluation. So first, we're going to go off with leaf damage, obviously with our evergreen plants. Oof. This guy on campus, this is a Chinese evergreen oak. It's actually the only one that we have on campus, and it is the Quercus mercinifolia. It is zoned, according to Durr, 7 to 9, but maybe zone 6. So it could survive in here, but it can definitely prefer having things a little bit warmer. And as you can see, it's suffered a bit of damage. This is not a variegated tree. So it had quite a bit of this marginal necrosis that happened. All of this plant tissue has just been completely damaged. And from the outside, this tree looks in rough shape. But if we go a little bit on the interior, we can actually see that there's plenty of green tissue still in here. It's almost as if the outside was insulating the inside. So even though it's somewhat on the edge of not being hardy for the region, its inside is still protected by those damaged leaves on the outside. Well, here's another plant, one that doesn't quite look all that great. It looks like a hay bale. This is a Hinoki cypress. I believe this cultivar is called Slender. Canacypris obtusa, it's ranged for zones 5 to 8, and the leaves look pretty toast. Although it's important to remember with these Canacypris that you can pop them over and you can actually still see quite a bit of green right here. So this foliage, while bronzed, isn't dead yet. And actually, bronzing color for a lot of like the arborvitaes and the Camacypris, they will do that in colder temperatures. What's really important with this all like foliage is at the tips, and as long as these tips aren't damaged, then they will produce new growth. And at this moment, they're still a little bronzed, but I don't view these as damaged growing tips. So this tree will probably just come out just fine. Now, this is an example of where the alls are, beyond repair. They are, you know, bright yellow, almost white. They're desiccated, and everything along these stems is no longer that sort of tannish color. It's more of a leathery, sort of reddish brown color. So these areas will die off. But this is also from the interior. So evergreens eventually do lose their interior growth. So it's nothing really to be necessarily worried about at this moment. So one of the last ones for the evergreens that I want to look into is this guy. This guy is a monkey puzzle. Uh, this is actually the only specimen that we have. It is zoned for zone 7 to 11. The reason that the 7 has a question mark is this is a South American and Central American species, and there's just not a lot of information on it. It's a pretty rare tree to get. And actually, in that their manual, they actually reference Knoxville as being the home of one of these monkey puzzle trees, which I found kind of interesting. And I'd be curious if that guy was still around and how it fared. But you can see definitely had some marginal necrosis, a lot like that evergreen oak, but the stems are still a little green. This was not too long after, I believe this was early January, and it was, definitely having some issues, but I was fairly confident that it at least had a 50-50 shot because it had a good couple of years in the ground and it's in somewhat of a protected area. Well, a couple months down the road, or about a month down the road, the the leaflets are not looking so great. The stems aren't looking so great, but right here, there's still a live bud. So I'm just going to monitor this guy, cut out the dead. But that's the risk that I ran planting this guy in uh, where it's potentially out of zoned for the area. These little microbursts can happen, and they happen. I'm sure anybody can remember a time where the temperatures can drop down uh, unseasonably cold in your area. Oh, yes. Sorry. So we'll also talk about frost cracks, though this will be primarily for our deciduous trees. So they've lost their leaves, they're not going to have that leaf tissue damage, but there's still that expanding and contracting of water as it freezes in those tissues. And sometimes it can result in what's known as a frost crack. So this here is a nuttall oak, Quercus nataliae or Quercus texana, and it is zoned for 5 to 9. Like it is well within our zone, and yet it is developing. This developed a pretty bad frost crack. So it's a little bit unclear about why this has necessarily happened. I mean, obviously, the expanding and contracting of that tissue as the wood tissues wanted to shrink and the water wanted to expand. It obviously reached a breaking point, but it's not clear as to why this has been specifically susceptible when it should have been just fine. Could have been in the location, could have been cultural practices, it's not really sure. So we have another example. This is also another nuttall oak, and you can see that it had a frost crack in years past, and it is starting to heal over. Um, Again, we're not really sure as to why we have several trees that just keep developing frost cracks, whether it's the nursery practices or whether it's our cultural practices that are happening on campus. But it possibly uh, just could be a continuous problem for these particular trees and may need to be addressed in the future. But right now, we're just looking for signs of decay and sort of just monitoring right now, since the trees do keep providing a lot more wound closure and it continues to grow. So lastly, we're going to talk about containerized plants. And these are two trees we have. These are Japanese black pines that I put in several years ago in these containers. And I personally kind of view these Japanese black pines as a bit of rock stars for tough situations for an evergreen, tough non-native. So our zones are zoned all the way down to 5 into 8. And while these guys did get a little bit of damage right here, their candles are still perfectly fine. So these things will come right out of this. It'll shed off these damaged needles and just grow just fine. And you can see in this container is actually a very thick concrete container, and it's in a fairly protected-ish area. So it ended up working out. Some species are more susceptible to freeze damage, particularly if they're roots. So if you have a very fleshy root system, I want to consider not having them in a container or potentially protecting those containers during those colder winter months. Ginkgo, Japanese maple, they do have somewhat susceptible root systems to freeze damage. So, how do you know if your tree is dead or not? Well, you can do a scratch test. So, scratching into this bark, this should actually show a green color. As you see that the cambium should be right under there. This is actually a dead branch. This tree actually died off so that I could do this scratch test for you. And I didn't necessarily need to do the scratch test because you can kind of see the tissue is sort of wrinkled up as it's starting to dry out. So I already knew that this was dying off. So you can do the scratch test to make sure that you still have green, but that's not necessarily going to guarantee that your tree is alive. And it actually will open it up to exposing that tissue, to the elements. Um, Another way to check it would be to do some bud pinching. So, where you can pinch the buds off, look in them, and see actually if they have green tissue or if they're browned out or just mush, and that can give you a sense of uh, if the tree is going to at least leaf out in the springtime. Now, the reason I'm not a big fan in a lot of cases of the scratch test is that you can have a scratch test and then have no viable buds, and it wouldn't really even matter because now it has to use all that energy to make new buds. And if it doesn't have the reserves from the wintertime, it might struggle or might not, actually come out at all that next year, essentially being dead without knowing it's dead yet. So the last one, this is more for containerized ones, is the inspection of the roots. You can see by pulling the tree material or the woody material out. You can see if those roots are mushy, if they're discolored, if they're blackened or very dark brown, where they should have nice, fleshy growing root tips. And lastly, just to wait. You can wait until the growing season starts and when everything starts to leaf out, and you can make that determination. The reason that I'm somewhat advocating for the wait and see approach is that winter isn't over yet, and there's still potential for late winter freezing damage. Our last day here in East Tennessee, our last day of you know, freezing temperatures at night is usually right around mid-April, but we've still had snow and freezing temperatures as early as the beginning of May. So this brings me to my last sort of test case. And this is an American hornbeam, and it's a native, zoned 3 to 9, huge, huge range. This was late spring, early summer of 2022. And I stumbled across this while driving by, and I went, "Oh, that doesn't look right." So I went up there and noticed that it had all of its catkins, all of its male catkins had come out, but hardly any leaves. In fact, every bud that I examined was dead. I cut into it. There was obviously we have some tissue damage. Um, the scratch test was inconsistent. I thought this tree was dead. It was a goner in my mind. And in talking with various people with extension and with my boss, the campus arborist here at UT, and several professors, best I can figure what would happen in this case was extremely bad timing. We had a late winter cold snap, and since it actually was able to produce its catkins, all those catkins were full of water, and I'm imagining that at this time, all of those buds that it was just about to have open, it was flooding those with water so that they could expand and then release the catkins and release the leaves. But temperatures dropped, everything's full of water. It's like a bunch of water balloons, and they all just sort of popped all at once. So my boss said, "Okay, take the tree out, put it on your list." This tree is kind of a hard tree to get to, especially with foot traffic. So I said, "Okay, you know what? I'll put it on my list, and it's not a danger to anyone. I'll remove it in the summertime." So I come by in the summertime after all the students are gone, and I was a little surprised to find out that this tree wasn't dead. It certainly died back several feet, but it was producing quite a lot of growth. And I made the call to see how this goes, and I let it keep growing. It kept putting out new growth. Still hadn't senesced those male catkins yet, but it was trying to grow. So let it go, and I ended up removing its the dead tissue later on in the summer, and we will see. It may end up being just fine going forward. We'll see, but it definitely had some struggles. So what are the takeaways in this? Well, I guess the first thing would be to not panic. and to resist the urge to just go in and hack away whatever you think is dead, because even that dead material on the outside can still have some insulating effects for some of that vulnerable tissue that's still inside the crown of that plant, like we saw with that evergreen oak. You should monitor for its response growth and also monitor for pest pressures and any signs of decay. And if the tree does die, replant with species or cultivars that are appropriate for your hardiness zone. And if you insist on planting sort of questionably hardy species, then that's just a potential risk that you run for these cold snaps. And that is what an evolving landscape is. Uh, you all should also have a plan, hopefully, for protecting or removing your containerized plants or your containers with sensitive plants. And don't be afraid to reach out to your county extension agent if you have any questions about freeze damage, evaluating it, or sort of deciding uh, where you go from there. I want to thank you guys so much, and good luck to everyone this year.